development aid which is completely linked to French finance capital and often came with strings attached. For instance, if you received a loan, first you'd have to pay it back, but also one of the conditions of the loan is that you have to use it to buy French goods or contract with French companies. In other words, the French imperialists benefited twice. They benefited from getting the interest on the loan and from the extra profits from getting these contracts. In addition, the African states signed treaties giving France the right of first refusal over their natural resources. So for instance, in Niger is one of the biggest uranium sources on the planet. It's the source of 30% of France's nuclear power. You know, then power stations, 30% rely on uranium from Niger, and 100% of its military uranium that keeps it a nuclear-armed imperialist power comes from Niger. Niger has to give France right of first refusal. The only currently operating uranium mine in Niger is operated by a French monopoly called Orano, which is majority owned by the French state. As you can imagine, the environmental impact on neighboring cities is immense. Higher rates of people dying from cancer. Workers who leave the mines usually tend to die within about 2 years. No compensation, no insurance, no health and safety put in because there is not a state strong enough to enforce it. In reality, it's up to the French state whether Orano carries out reforms or not. And you might be asking the question, well, how is this position of absolute dependence and outright naked exploitation, how has that gone on for so many decades? Don't these now independent states just legislate differently? One small reason is they have signed treaties with what's called stability clauses, meaning that if they legislate against the interests of, say, Orano in Niger, then they can be sued by the company because it's disrupted the stability of its operations. Some academics estimate that Niger takes only about 12% of the marketable value of its own uranium. But anyway, you might be wondering, how has this come to pass? And the cornerstone of all of this is the maintenance of political dependence. And the way they've done this is in a process that within France is known as la France-Afrique, which is an extremely shady regime of client states. First of all, during the colonial period, a small colonial bourgeoisie, so plantation owners, indigenous plantation owners, for instance, like Félix Houphouët in the Ivory Coast, were incorporated into the French political system. He was actually elected a minister of the French government. In other words, a domestic ruling class was effectively groomed by the French imperialists to put them in power on independence. If any of the domestic leaders they thought were a bit shaky, they simply replaced them. In 1958, the leaders of Cameroon and Niger were just replaced by France. This was still under colonial control, so that the new leaders would be more amenable to the cooperation treaties. They duly signed the cooperation treaties, and this wonderful family, Macron says, between France and Africa, it must be a love story. This abusive relationship, this toxic relationship, is maintained by good old-fashioned straightforward corruption, suitcases full of cash, holidays on the Côte d'Azur, mansions in the United States, and so on. But in addition to that, military support. Military cooperation treaties mean that France basically has a free hand in the whole region, not only to maintain order, internal order, which means basically intervening to depose an unfriendly government, but also to protect its national security interests, which include oil, gas, and uranium, and to maintain permanent military bases. But in addition to that, not only the French military, but French mercenaries, people who fought in the Algerian War and then started basically plying their trade across the whole African continent. At one point, we talk about Wagner now, but not that long ago, only like 10, 20 years ago, the French were actually the biggest mercenary force in Africa. And what they would do is they would hire out their services to local dictators to maintain them in power. This was all done in the name of stability. And this is a key word when we talk about imperialism. What is imperialism? Imperialism is capitalist monopolies linked to finance capital, the domination of the banks, which themselves extend their tentacles into the bourgeois state itself. Why? To maintain guaranteed super profits and stability for the individual capitalist state. Interestingly, Trotsky pointed out, I think in 1905, that imperialism, by putting out these small forest fires, by maintaining stability, actually prepares the way for an even greater conflagration. And that's what we're seeing now. But this stability of local regimes amounted to basically maintaining people in power for decades. Omar Bongo, who is the father of Ali Bongo, who was recently deposed in Gabon, ruled the country from 1967 until his death in 2009, if I remember correctly. He was a major ally of La France-Afrique. Likewise, Félix Houphouët in the Ivory Coast ruled from independence in 1960 until his death in the early 90s. And whenever there was a threat of a coup or revolution against these people, often the French military would intervene directly in order to keep them in power. They did this in Chad since the 1980s. France has been fighting on behalf of the Chad dictatorship. And even in the Central African Republic, which now has fallen under Russian influence, actually as early as 2013, the French army intervened in order to support the incumbent president in the civil war.